It is very hard for anyone to explain how granite that hard was shaped with tools that simple. That single sentence has haunted Egyptology for over a century, and it is about to get harder to ignore. Because somewhere along the Nile, inside a quarry most tourists walk past in 5 minutes, there are marks in the stone that should not exist according to everything we have been taught. Long curved cuts, repeating patterns, a precision that looks deliberate, not accidental. And when modern researchers finally turned advanced imaging technology and artificial intelligence loose on this stone, what came back was not a confirmation, it was a contradiction. Stay with me, because once you see what they found, the comfortable version of this story stops holding together. The place is called the Aswan Granite Quarry, and it sits quietly on the banks of the Nile in southern Egypt, far from the crowds that swarm the pyramids 200 miles north. Most people who visit barely glance at it, half-finished blocks lying in the dust, a flat desert silence, a tour guide pointing and moving on. But the moment you stop walking and actually look at the rock, something about it refuses to sit right in your mind. This is not soft limestone that crumbles under a fingernail. This is granite, one of the hardest natural materials on the planet, and on its surface are long, sweeping, almost rhythmic cuts that look less like the product of human struggle and more like the output of a controlled, repeatable process. For decades, the official explanation has been simple and, on the surface, reasonable. Ancient Egyptians, according to mainstream archaeology, used dolerite, a stone even harder than granite, shaped into heavy, round pounders. Workers struck the granite over and over for hours, for days, for months, slowly wearing it down until it gave up its shape. It is a brutal, patient, almost unbearable method, and the scale of labor involved is staggering. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of laborers cycled through these quarries, working in punishing shifts under the desert sun year after year just to free a handful of massive blocks from the bedrock. On paper, given enough time and enough bodies, this theory explains everything. But paper is not stone, and stone does not lie. Here is where the story takes its first real turn, and it is something most people have never heard. In recent years, researchers have stopped simply repeating the dolerite theory and started actually testing it under controlled conditions. And what they found complicates the textbook version far more than most documentaries admit. Experimental archaeologists built replica dolerite pounders and struck granite blocks exactly as the old theory describes. The marks that resulted were rough, irregular, and inconsistent. Some strikes barely scratched the surface, while others gouged unevenly deep. That is normal. That is what a human body does under repeated physical strain. Fatigue sets in, grip shifts, angles drift. No matter how skilled the worker, biology imposes limits that no amount of determination can erase. Now place that result beside the actual scoop marks carved into the Aswan bedrock, and the contrast becomes difficult to dismiss. The real cuts at Aswan show long, even almost flowing arcs, with a level of spacing and consistency that should not be possible from repeated hand-striking alone. This is not a fringe observation. It has been written about by mainstream researchers and independent engineers alike, and it has never been fully resolved. Even Egyptologist Mark Leaner, one of the most respected names in the field, has personally tested dolerite pounding on Aswan granite and found it far harder to replicate the precision of the original marks than the simple theory suggests. That detail rarely makes it into casual conversations about this site, but it should, because it means even the experts who defend the traditional story openly admit the full picture is not settled. So if pounding alone cannot fully explain what is carved into this stone, what does? This is where modern science has actually started catching up to the mystery, and the answer is more interesting and far less mystical than most viral videos want you to believe. But it is no less remarkable. Over the past 15 years, a quieter discovery has been reshaping how researchers understand ancient stoneworking, and it centers on something almost nobody expects: fire. Geological researchers studying Egyptian quarries identified something called fire setting, a technique where intense heat is applied directly to a rock surface, then followed by rapid cooling, often using water or another liquid. The dramatic temperature shock causes microscopic fractures to spread through the granite's internal structure, weakening it along predictable lines. Once the stone has been thermally stressed in this way, far less mechanical force is needed to remove material, and the resulting cuts become smoother and more controlled than raw pounding alone could ever produce. Experimental studies recreating this method have shown that fire setting dramatically increases how much granite can be removed per hour, compared to pounding tools used in isolation. In some tests, the difference was the gap between cutting a few millimeters an hour and stripping away entire centimeters in the same span of time. I read that again, because this changes everything about how we should picture the ancient workers at Aswan. They were not simply men swinging stones against rock for years on end with nothing but raw effort. According to the emerging research, they may have been running a layered industrial process. heat the stone, shock it with rapid cooling to crack its internal structure, then use pounding tools and copper chisels to remove the now weakened material along the lines the fire had already opened up. This is not random brute force. This is something closer to engineering. And the evidence for this is not just theoretical. Tomb paintings from ancient Egypt, including a well-documented mural inside the tomb of the official Rekhmir, depict workers pouring a liquid over heated stone blocks, a scene long puzzled over by Egyptologists. Inscriptions found at the quarry site of Wadi Hammamat reference the use of natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, alongside fire in stoneworking contexts. For years, these references were treated as obscure ritual details. Now, researchers studying thermal fracturing techniques believe they may be looking at instructions for an actual industrial process, hidden in plain sight inside religious and administrative texts for thousands of years. What most people are not seeing is that the proof was never missing. It was simply misread. But the fire theory only solves part of the puzzle, because fire setting weakens stone. It does not carve elegant, flowing arcs into it with anything resembling precision. So researchers turned to a second technique that has quietly gained serious traction: the use of wooden wedges and water. After the stone had been weakened by heat shock, ancient workers appear to have cut narrow channels along the desired separation lines, inserted dry wooden wedges into those channels, and then soaked the wood thoroughly with water. Wood expands when wet, and that expansion generates enormous, steady directional pressure that propagates cracks precisely along the line of the channel rather than scattering randomly across the surface, the way a hammer blow inevitably does. Think about what that actually means for the marks we see today. A wedge and water technique layered on top of fire-weakened stone would produce far more linear, far more controlled fracture lines than blunt force pounding ever could on its own. It would explain the strange combination researchers keep finding at Aswan: areas of rough, irregular pounding sitting right next to smoother, more deliberate channel-like cuts, almost as if multiple techniques were being used in sequence by people who understood exactly which tool to apply at which stage of the process. This is not chaos, this is a workflow. This is also where modern imaging technology has finally entered the picture in a way that goes beyond guesswork. A team of researchers used a method called reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, to study tool marks across multiple Egyptian hardstone sites in extraordinary detail. RTI works by capturing dozens of images of the same surface under different lighting angles, then digitally combining them to reveal microscopic texture variations, invisible to the naked eye, the kind of subtle ridges, grooves, and directional patterns left behind by specific tools and techniques. This is not science fiction. This is the same category of analysis used in forensic investigation and museum conservation, now turned loose on 3,000-year-old granite. And here is what most people watching casual documentaries about Aswan never hear. The RTI research, combined with direct consultation with modern stone carvers and experimental archaeology using replica ancient tools, did not produce a single, tidy, satisfying answer. It produced disagreement, a real, ongoing, unresolved disagreement among serious scholars about exactly what tools were used, exactly how they were used, and exactly how the range of surface textures we observe at sites like Aswan came to exist. This is the real story that most viral content quietly leaves out. It is not that mainstream science has no explanation. It is that mainstream science has multiple competing explanations, none of which has fully closed the case, and that uncertainty is precisely why this site keeps pulling people back in. Now think about the scale of what was actually being attempted here, because this is where the stakes climb higher than most people realize. The most famous object at Aswan is the unfinished obelisk, a single piece of granite that, if completed, would have weighed over 1,000 tons and stood as the largest monolithic structure ever attempted by human hands at that point in history. It still lies exactly where it was abandoned, half-carved, fused to the bedrock it was being separated from. The official explanation is almost insultingly simple. A crack appeared during the carving process, and the project was abandoned. But here is where the official story starts to strain under its own weight. Tool marks on the obelisk continue past the point where that crack runs through the stone. Work appears to have continued even after the flaw had already formed, which raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. If a fatal crack was the reason the project was scrapped, why does the evidence suggest the workers kept cutting around it for some time afterward? Mainstream archaeology has never produced a fully satisfying answer to that detail, and it remains one of the genuinely open questions at the site, not resolved, not explained away, simply sitting there in the stone for anyone willing to look closely enough. And this is where the story stops being about one object and starts being about an entire vanished workforce, because the same category of cut marks identified at Aswan, the scoop-like patterns, the channel lines associated with wedge splitting, The smoother zones, consistent with thermal weakening, have also been documented at other major Egyptian hard stone sites, including structures connected to the Giza Plateau itself. That is not a coincidence confined to one quarry. That is a signature, repeated across hundreds of kilometers, suggesting that whatever combination of fire, water, wedges, copper tools, and disciplined labor organization the ancient Egyptians had developed, it was not a local trick. It was a shared body of technical knowledge, refined and transmitted across an entire civilization's stoneworking tradition. This is where the real mystery deepens, and it has nothing to do with aliens or lost super technology. The real mystery is organizational, coordinating tens of thousands of workers, supplying enough fuel to repeatedly heat shock massive granite surfaces, managing the timing of water-soaked wedges so cracks propagated correctly instead of shattering the stone uselessly, and maintaining consistent technique across multiple quarry sites separated by enormous distances. That level of logistical and technical sophistication, achieved roughly 4,500 years ago, without writing systems as we understand them today, fully standardizing instruction, is genuinely staggering when you actually sit with it. According to informed analysis of the archaeological record, what we are looking at is not evidence of a lost civilization with technology beyond our own. It is evidence that we have consistently underestimated how sophisticated Bronze Age engineering and labor management actually were. So why does the myth of impossible, unexplainable precision keep surviving, generation after generation, video after video? Part of the answer is psychological, and it says as much about us as it does about ancient Egypt. There is something deeply uncomfortable about admitting that people without modern machinery, without electricity, without industrial metallurgy, organize themselves well enough to outperform our intuitive sense of what should be possible. It feels almost easier to imagine forgotten technology or unexplained intervention than to accept that human coordination, patience, and accumulated technical knowledge alone can produce results this impressive. But that discomfort is not evidence of mystery. It is evidence of how narrow our assumptions about ancient capability have always been. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, not because it points to something supernatural, but because of what it reveals about how fragile knowledge actually is across time. The techniques behind fire setting, wedge splitting, and large-scale coordinated quarrying were not perfectly preserved and passed down in some unbroken golden chain of mastery. Later periods of Egyptian history show quarrying methods that, in some respects, appear less refined than earlier work, a detail that has puzzled researchers studying the chronological development of stoneworking technique. Read that again. Technical mastery does not always move in a straight line of constant improvement. Sometimes specialized knowledge concentrates in particular generations, particular workshops, particular periods of political stability and resource investment, and then it fades, not because it was lost to some catastrophe, but because the social and economic conditions that sustain that level of specialized expertise simply did not continue indefinitely. Think about what that actually implies. If a civilization as well documented as ancient Egypt, with monumental architecture, written records, and an unbroken cultural lineage spanning thousands of years, could still lose the finer points of a sophisticated technical process within a few centuries, what does that tell us about how much we might be missing from civilizations that left far less behind? This is not a question about Aswan anymore. This is a question about the limits of historical memory itself, and it should make you look at every confident textbook timeline with a slightly more careful eye. None of this means we should throw out skepticism in the other direction either. It would be just as misleading to claim that every open question about Aswan has now been neatly solved by fire and water and wedges. The truth, the actual research-grounded truth, sits in a far less satisfying place than either extreme. Serious scholars studying these tool marks through advanced imaging still disagree about specific sequences, specific tool compositions, and specific combinations of techniques used across different sections of the quarry. That ongoing disagreement is not a weakness in the science. It is what honest, unresolved investigation looks like when the evidence is genuinely complicated, and it is far more compelling than a tidy answer handed down with false confidence. So where does that leave us, standing in front of this stone after everything we have just walked through? It leaves us with a civilization that managed to combine fire, water, basic but cleverly applied physics, immense organized labor, and generational technical knowledge into a process capable of shaping some of the hardest natural stone on Earth without the benefit of a single piece of machinery we would recognize today. It leaves us with an unfinished 1,000-ton monument that may have been abandoned for reasons more complicated than a simple crack. And it leaves us with a quiet, uncomfortable reminder that even extraordinarily well-documented civilizations can lose mastery of techniques that once felt unforgettable. The marks are still there in the granite, waiting for the next round of imaging technology, the next experimental archaeologist willing to test the old assumptions again, the next researcher willing to admit that the textbook answer might be incomplete rather than wrong. Because that is really what this site has always been asking of us. Not belief in something mystical, but honesty about how much we still do not fully understand about the people who came before us, and how easily even their most impressive achievements can slip out of memory if no one keeps asking the harder questions. So I want to leave you with this. If a civilization capable of shaping a 1,000-ton block of granite with fire, water, and coordinated human effort could still lose the finer details of that mastery within a handful of centuries, what does that say about everything else from our past that we assume we already understand completely? What other techniques, other solutions, other pieces of hard-won human ingenuity have quietly slipped through the cracks of history simply because no one was left to write them down clearly enough? The stone at Aswan is not finished answering that question, and neither are we.